Thanks, Don, and welcome to all the members of the new Midwest Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council. Thank you for being here. And thanks to all of you for having come for today's meeting. I'm going to do a very brief introduction, I hope, but I recognize that this is a new organization, a new setting for the Midwest. Hopefully we can keep the slides going. But, and I just thought it would be helpful to set the groundwork. I know there's been a fair amount of discussion about the efforts that this report represents, the intentions, the process, the goals, et cetera. So I think it will be helpful to kind of set the landscape a little bit of historical perspective and otherwise. So why are we here today? A main part of the reason is because of the tremendous innovation that has brought significant benefits to patients with multiple myeloma. I remember when I was training as a physician, the last time I personally treated a patient with multiple myeloma, it was almost 30 years ago. It was at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, and I can clearly remember how brutal the treatments were, how few they were, and how short the lifespans expected were for patients with multiple myeloma. That was a very, very difficult time for patients with that diagnosis. And since then, that was a long time ago, but obviously things have evolved, and recently there has been a tremendous set of innovations that have brought new treatment options with real gains for patients with myeloma. And when we talk to patient groups, they emphasize the fact that the treatment gains have been real. This is a graph from an article that shows the 5- and 10-year relative survival of patients from 1998 to 2001 in the first bullet there, up through 2002 to 2005, which was when bortezomib and, by the way, I'm going to start the practice of messing up the drug names. I will bounce back and forth between trade and generic and probably get neither right, so bear with me. But you remember the drugs. Revlimid and Velcade came in this phase, and then there have been subsequent innovations in new drugs. What's interesting is that there are actually significant improvements even before those drugs came into the market. But what's clear is that patients have benefited from significant advances, and that's due a lot to the innovation of new drugs and to the options that patients now have. And we heard from patient groups how important this is not just for patients, but for their families, for their ability to work, for their broader role in society. This is real progress. Now at the same time, oh, that's too bad, we're missing a slide. Let me go here first. So over that time, we're also aware that the costs for cancer care generally have been going up. Some of these data are from a few years ago, but in 2012, the FDA approved 12 new cancer drugs. 11 of them cost over $100,000 per year. And for all cancer drugs, the average monthly costs have doubled in the last decade, from around $5,000 a month to $10,000 a month. And I took a look, and at least for Revlimid and for some of the others who've been around that long, this has been essentially true, that they have about doubled over 10 years. And this has created real tension in a lot of different ways. By the way, I'm curious, in the audience here, how many people either have multiple myeloma or have a family member or a friend with multiple myeloma? Thank you for being here. How many of you have a friend or yourself, a family member with breast cancer? Okay, you can keep your hands up for both. How about multiple sclerosis? Congestive heart failure? I think just about everybody in the audience is either a survivor, a current patient, or has a loved one with one of these diseases. And part of the challenge is how we work together to try to share the benefits of medical innovation across different conditions. We've seen the progress with multiple myeloma. Part of the challenge is that the costs and the ability to share the benefits of this medical innovation across different disease conditions is part of the reason that we're here today. And how do we do that? How do we come together and talk about ways to do that that are fair, that are sustainable, and that maintain the kind of progress that patients have experienced? Now let me go back to this slide, because I guess I want to make the point too that it's not just in healthcare that we have some of these tensions and issues, not just within healthcare. Apologies for the small font here, but this is a chart from economists at Harvard that looked at state spending in the state of Massachusetts over a decade. And inflation-adjusted spending by the state for healthcare went up by 59% over that time period. And the total was about an increase of $5.1 billion inflation-adjusted. Now you may ask, where did that money come from? Some of it did come from increased taxes. But where most of it came from was from decreases in state spending on public health, on mental health, on education, infrastructure and housing, human services, local aid, and public safety. This means fewer teachers, fewer policemen, fewer people checking, again, public health. This is part of the dialogue that our country needs to have. It's not just within healthcare, it's the fact that healthcare is part of the societal choice that we make around how we try to provide benefits for all of our citizens. And it's not easy. And I think this is part of the reason that we're here today. We're also here today, though, because I think we really do share a common vision of a future. It's a future in which better evidence allows the more personalized and tailored treatment for patients with multiple myeloma, so that that slope of the graph of improvements can maybe have a step change and even get better. We all want that, better evidence, more personalized treatment, and we want it in a way that can prove sustainable for patients, for those who pay for insurance, and for broader society, reflected in that last slide. I really think we share that common vision. The question is, how do we get there? And part of the discussion today is based on a view that we get there partly by trying to take a very clear-eyed view of the evidence and doing the best we can to say, what do we learn from the evidence that's existent today? What new evidence do we need going forward? And part of it is by having a broader conversation with stakeholders around the table. A lot of these discussions either don't happen or they happen behind closed doors. And part of the reason we're here today is because CEPAC is an attempt to bring that discussion into the public domain, to listen to all voices, and to try to find a way to work together forward in this journey. So in that vein, I want to give just a little bit of background about ICER and, again, about the Midwest CEPAC. So ICER is a nonprofit, independent nonprofit organization. We were an academic research group at Harvard for the first about 7 years of our existence, and then we've become independent for the past couple years. And our work has been to try to, in a sense, do the back office scientific work on looking at evidence around both clinical effectiveness and value, and then try to figure out how to foster the public dialogue by convening groups like CEPAC. Now, I'll briefly mention, because we do think seriously about conflicts of interest, that for ICER, and this is on our website, 70% of our overall funding comes from nonprofit foundations, and that's the money that's used for the report generation and for these kinds of public meetings. And Midwest CEPAC is specifically a part of a grant from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation based in Texas. The other 30% of our overall organizational support is specifically for a policy summit that we hold between manufacturers and health plans, and also some web-based evidence kind of webinars. And that money comes from health plans and from drug manufacturers into a pot for that purpose. So, as I mentioned, we do convene public groups. The Midwest CEPAC is our third. We have one in New England, we have in California, and guess what? There are outstanding people in the Midwest who have been waiting their turn to have public discussions about these same issues, and I think you heard the backgrounds of the folks at the table are quite distinguished. So the Midwest CEPAC, they are independent folks. They come together. The purpose is to road test our reports. They are here to push at it, to pull on it, to ask questions, to explore it. And yes, then they do take votes in public to try to give a signal of what they think about the strength of evidence for different treatment options and about the value. Again, this is somewhat unique, certainly in the United States, to have this kind of public group discussing value, but it's part of the conversation that we really hope to foster. So how is our report developed? We start, first of all, we try to figure out topics, because we don't do all new drugs or all new services. But I should mention, by the way, that ICER in these meetings sometimes focus on non-drug topics. So we look at a variety of things that can hopefully help the health system understand better the evidence on effectiveness and value. But when we picked this topic, it was because there were several new drugs, new innovative drugs that were entering, and people had a lot of questions about how do we know, what's the evidence say about how they compare to other drugs, what about their value, what can we learn from the existing evidence? And we start by reaching out to clinical experts and to patient groups to try to get their view of what's important here. What can we learn from patients about the outcomes that really matter the most to them? We know what we can find in the literature, but what do patients feel about progression-free survival? What do patients feel about the different kinds of side effects? We learned a lot about the roller coaster that patients are on. We learned a lot about how it's really important for them to feel like they have options between oral drugs, IV drugs. It may affect a lot about how they can manage their lives with their families. So we learn a lot about it at the beginning. And then we listen also to the manufacturers and other stakeholders to try to get their views on where the cracks in the evidence are. Where should we focus? What's important to kind of hone in on? Then we go and we do a broad-based review of the evidence that we can find. That's preferentially in the peer-reviewed literature, but we also, because this is such a fast-moving field, we recognize we have to be open to evidence that's being presented at meetings, anything that seems cutting edge, if you will. We try to wrap that in. It's challenging when something's moving as fast as multiple myeloma, but we definitely try to do that. We, at the same time, launch an effort to try to do what's called a cost-effectiveness model. That's a way to try to forecast downstream how the benefits that drugs bring to patients play out through the years, how that might affect costs. Maybe it increased costs, maybe it decreased costs. We try to bring the big picture, because we're not just focused on drug costs alone. We do want to see whether this affects, and maybe in a good way, the broader cost to the health system. And that's part of what we do to pull together in our report. We also try to make a very rough estimate of what the potential budget impact of new drugs might be if they're not really tightly managed by insurers in a variety of different ways. And that's all wrapped up in our report. Then, as part of what we're going to be doing later today, and I thought I'd go ahead and get out in front of this now because we could have done it midway, but this is the framework that we use in presenting the evidence in our reports, and it's kind of the paradigm for the information that the council itself will think about when it takes its votes. So what we do is we start again with this bedrock look at the evidence on comparative clinical effectiveness. We then, or kind of concomitantly, look at the information we can gain from the cost effectiveness model on the incremental costs for different clinical outcomes. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the QALY, the Quality Adjusted Life Year. How many of you have heard of it before? Keep your hand up if you think it's a bad tool to use to judge value of healthcare decision making. All right, fair number of you. We could spend a whole day talking about the QALY, but I do want to dispel a few, I think, actual kind of illusions about it to a certain extent. First, most of you know that the QALY was largely developed and standardized in the United States decades ago by physicians and health economists. So it's not a foreign transport into the US system. It's been a long-running tool that health economists and others have used to try to make sure that they do capture the long-term value of things. Because it is very easy to focus only on the short-term budget impact and to worry about that. Cost effectiveness and QALYs are used to look way downstream. And one thing that's often raises a concern is that it somehow devalues patients' lives if they're disabled or otherwise sick in some way. Basically what QALYs do is that it starts with patients where they are, So let's assume we have 2 patients with multiple myeloma, and we're looking at drugs for them. If 2 different drugs, it didn't even need 2 patients, just 1 patient, but if you have 2 drugs and they both extend life the same amount, let's say it's 6 months. Let's say we want to give that 3 stars because that's good. We want to capture that benefit that the drugs bring. But what if one of the drugs has serious side effects, very bad diarrhea, bad effects on the nerves, maybe it affects vision or the heart? What a QALY does is it says, well, we don't want to give both of those drugs that extend life 3 stars and stop there. If one has really serious side effects, we need to kind of take a little bit away from that, kind of rating, if you will. Now, patients should get the chance to make the judgment about how they value the different pieces of this. But when you're looking across a population, a QALY allows you to make sure that you fairly take into consideration any effect on quality of life. Usually, if it's going to decrease it is the concern. While you want to capture the benefit, you have to at least think about what decrement that will give you too. So a QALY doesn't say that someone's life is less valuable if they have multiple myeloma or some disability. A gain is a gain wherever you're starting from. And so the QALY just helps us be fair in comparing apples to apples when we're looking at how do we want to consider the gains that we make with good new treatment. So I'm sure we'll return to this issue and people will have different opinions. The QALY is not the only thing, as you'll see, that we or the CEPAC use when they're judging value. And when we talk to patient groups in particular, as I mentioned, we ask them, what are the outcomes here that maybe the clinical evidence is missing? Here in particular, other benefits or disadvantages. What does that mean? That's explicitly, do drugs help families? Do they help broader society? Do they help patients in ways that were missed in the clinical effectiveness research? We want to be open to hearing about these issues and for considering them as part of the broader judgment about what we call care value. And contextual considerations are important too. In particular, sometimes there are conditions where there has never been a treatment that's been acceptable before, and we have the first leg up, a first something that helps us. If it's a very serious condition and it's the first possible treatment we've seen before, that's an important contextual consideration. And there are others. But we view this as part of a kind of a combined continuum of judgment that goes into a final vote on care value, which is what the CEPAC will do. And then again, I mentioned the issue around potential short-term budget impact. But here again, with the anchor being the care value, we want to at least think about this and probably talk about it as part of a discussion around what we call provisional health system value. Just because if you talk to people who manage health systems, they feel it's just impossible for them not to think about that at the same time. When they, for instance, hepatitis C treatments, which were tremendously valuable over the long term, were also tremendously expensive in the short term because of the large number of patients. And so wrestling with how we integrate that aspect of things and ultimately maximize the overall health system value is an important part of what we do. But the CEPAC will not vote on that. It's not a part of what the CEPAC will do going forward. So that's the broader value assessment framework. I think that's an important part that you should understand about why the report looks the way it does and how the discussion will flow and the ultimate votes. And so the goals for today, I think, are in a sense, three-part. In the short term, we really do hope that the report and the discussion can give us a good handle in the short term on what we can learn from the evidence and what we don't know. And that really is helpful for helping us look forward, because we really often find that there are critical pieces, very important to patients and to clinicians and others, that it's just basically missing. And we need better research. And we need to talk about how patients can be a leading driver, and that'll be part of our discussion in the latter part of the day. How can we engage with patients to help identify and lead the research that we need? And then I guess the broader goal is to try to sustain the ability for us to have these kinds of hard discussions, these hard conversations, where there are multiple goals, important goals that we all hold as important. And hopefully we can treat that discussion as an important outcome of the day. It's not going to be over after today. It's part of an ongoing process that we need to figure out a better way to bring evidence into the public light. So the agenda, so that we can now catch up with our time, is again, we're going to have a presentation of the evidence, followed by public comment, which we've actually extended the time for that for this meeting, so that we can have a broad set of manufacturers and patients who signed up and wanted to speak. There'll be a very brief lunch that will happen in the middle of the morning at 12:30 a.m. Actually be at 12:30 p.m. So we'll have that rapidly following up with the process where the CEPAC will further deliberate and vote with clinical experts brought up to contribute. Then following the votes, we'll have what we call the policy roundtable discussion. And that's where we'll kind of say, well, what next? What are the real key takeaways? And there we'll have patients, we'll have insurers at the table, we'll have clinical experts, and kind of engage in a broader discussion around what happens going forward from here. And we will adjourn by, it says 4:15 there, I think that will be at the latest, so that I know some of you have flights to catch.